We are slowly starting. Okay, thank you very much, everyone who came here today to this event with Michael van Praag. Maybe just quickly start in German. Vielen Dank, dass ihr heute alle da seid bei unserer Veranstaltung von der Tibet Initiative. Auch schön, ich heiße alle herzlich willkommen, die auch online zuschauen. Das Event findet heute auf Englisch statt. Es kann gerne, wenn jemand Fragen hat oder Übersetzung braucht, sich gerne melden, dann kommen wir auch gerne dazu oder helfen bei der Übersetzung ins Deutsche. Ansonsten gibt es die Möglichkeit, am Ende noch Fragen zu stellen. Sie können auch gerne Fragen in den Chat auf YouTube schreiben, die wir am Ende dann gerne noch mit aufnehmen und beantworten. Genau, und bevor wir starten, würde ich einen kurzen Einstieg geben und einmal Michael vorstellen. So, thank you everyone for coming and joining this event today. I'm here in Berlin. We are very happy that Michael took the time here to visit us today. Actually arrived yesterday and had 2 busy days in Germany and is leaving today to Switzerland as well because it's a special occasion. His book, Tibet Brief 2020, this is the English version. In German it's called Tibet erklärt. Will be published tomorrow in Zurich and hopefully soon also available in Germany. And yeah, that's why we have the opportunity today to speak directly with him so that he can tell us a little bit more about his years of research. Before we begin, I would like to give a brief introduction about you, so you can go directly into the topic. So you're originally from the Netherlands and now you're living in the US. And your journey with Tibet started already in a very early age. Your interest, I think, was 11, you said, and first time you met His Holiness in the age of 17. And from there on, you were always, focused on the status of Tibet, I would say, on a the legal area. And you studied international law in the US and as well in Utrecht in the Netherlands. And after receiving your doctorate, you also worked for several years as a lawyer. And from 1985 to 2011, you were the legal advisor of His Holiness, the Dalai Lama. Also very important is that you were founder or co-founder of the organization UNPO, the Underrepresented Nations and People Organization, and the organization Greta, which you also founded together with Mick Boltjes, which is also the co-author of the book. And both of you did important research. So after a long journey with Tibet, we are very happy today to still have you on our side and having you here to present probably your newest research. And before I pass over the microphone, I just wanted to say, or maybe give a question in advance with you, because you are a person who has decades of contact with Tibetans and the Tibetan history, starting with your thesis, which was already about the Tibetan status, going to the book, which probably many Tibet supporters and Tibetans know really well, the Status of Tibet, History, Rights and the Perspektiven in International Law, which was published in 1987. And now there is this new book. And I think it would be amazing for us to hear what has changed in the last decades, what are the new research and findings which you had during your journey in the last years. So yeah, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you. Thank you, and thank you for to you personally, but also to the Tibet Initiative Deutschland for arranging this. I'm sorry for those people who were not able to come because of train strike, but I'm sure that the people that are striking are doing it for some good reasons. And fortunately, it's online as well, and so we're able to share this moment with more people. But thank you so much for coming. Please excuse the fact that I'm doing this in English. I do understand German, so if there are German questions, I'm happy to answer them, but my German is very bad, and so I will not bother you and hurt your ears with my bad German. But please, if there's something you don't understand, I'm glad to explain or have someone translate. So I'm very happy to have this opportunity to share some thoughts with you. I think this is a very important time for Tibet. It's an important time for Tibet because the world is changing very fast. I mean, here in Europe, we notice it with the events very close by, the invasion of the Ukraine, the war that has now it's already been fought for so long, so much longer than many people expected. But in other parts of the world, there are shake-ups as well. And so by that I mean things change, they change quickly. And before we know it, Tibet will be affected by that as well. And it is important to be well informed, to be well prepared for the time that things change in such a way that new opportunities exist. And so this is also one of the reasons why I'm trying to inform some of the foreign ministries, some people in the press, in international organizations, about the reality of the situation in Tibet, about the reality of the Tibet-China conflict, and what can help in trying to work towards a resolution, but especially what harms the prospects for a resolution. And I say that particularly because I think that a lot of the behavior of governments today, and even in some cases of people in the media, harm the prospects for resolution of the Sino-Tibetan conflict more than they help. And so we need to make a shift, we need to make a change in that respect. So I'll say a few words about the status of Tibet today, then why it's important to expose the false or misleading narrative that China has been propagating on Tibet and on Tibet having always been a part of China. I'll mention what the nature of China's rule in Tibet is all about, and what obligations that creates for the international community, for our governments. And then I'll propose some policy changes that would be helpful to find a resolution of the Sino-Tibetan conflict. And of course, all these things are interrelated. So starting with the status of Tibet, it's actually quite simple. Tibet is an occupied state. And we've all been reminded of what occupation means because of the Russian invasion of parts of the Ukraine and occupation of parts of the Ukraine. I think for many people in Europe, that notion of occupation and what it means had somewhat been forgotten since the Second World War. New generations, etc., and people don't quite realize what it means. But now we've been reminded. We've been reminded of what aggression is, we've been reminded of what occupation means, and we've been reminded that we, the rest of the world, have an obligation not to recognize annexation by military force. This is a fundamental rule of international law. It's a fundamental principle on which the whole international order is based since the First World War and reinforced since the Second World War. And that is now in danger of being dismantled, of being weakened. And when we talk a little bit later, you'll see that Tibet is related in that situation. So Tibet is an occupied country, but China's disinformation campaign over the last 70 years, but particularly in the last 20 years or so, which has intensified the disinformation campaign, has resulted in many people no longer realizing that Tibet is occupied, no longer realizing that Tibet was aggressed, was invaded, and was occupied, and that this was it's a fairly simple, cut-dry situation. Tibet was an independent state. The big neighbor invaded it for strategic reasons more than anything else, and since then it's been occupied. There's also the feeling among some people who are less informed, that if a place has been occupied for a certain amount of time, for now, in Tibet's case, it's been 70 years, that means that the situation is normal and that the occupied country has become part of the occupier's territory. In other words, that if you hold on to something long enough, something that was illegal becomes legal. That is not true. In international law, there is no rule that says that at all. If it's illegal, it remains illegal, unless the people that have been occupied, in this case the Tibetans, agree to become part of that other country. In other words, if there's a negotiation and an agreement, or if there is simply no more opposition, if everybody, if there's, in other words, a different kind of peaceful resolution, which is that people accept the situation and that they no longer oppose it. And there's two ways of opposing it. One is for the population itself to oppose it by grassroots actions, by expressions of opposition, etc. The other is by the legal authority representing that occupied state opposing it. Now, in the case of Tibet, the Tibetan government in exile, the Central Tibetan Administration, is very clearly a continuation of the government of Tibet, of independent Tibet before the invasion. When His Holiness the Dalai Lama escaped into exile, he declared that he was reconstituting his government in exile. In other words, it's a continuation of the existing government. And that government, which is the legitimate authority representing Tibet and the Tibetan people, that government has consistently continued to oppose China's occupation of Tibet. And in the book, we analyze very extensively how all the official statements that have been made reflect that very clearly up to this day. So from that perspective, and then from the perspective of the people themselves, we all know that there has been ongoing resistance in Tibet in different ways. Originally, it was guerrilla warfare that transformed into more resistance in a more controlled atmosphere in the way of uprisings in different parts of Tibet, in 2008, very many uprisings in many parts of Tibet. And since that, because it's become even more difficult to protest, to demonstrate, to express one's opinion, we have seen this tragic self-immolations, again, in different parts of Tibet by different kinds of and ages of Tibetans, all representing an ongoing protest or opposition to the occupation of Tibet. And then there are more scholarly or artistic expressions of that opposition, both in music and in art and in other forms of expression that also indicate ongoing opposition. So I'm just mentioning this because for all these reasons, there's no legitimate reason to consider that Tibetans have accepted and have resolved themselves to being a part of the PRC unless something happens through negotiations or other that they are satisfied in a new status. So Tibet today is still an occupied country under illegal occupation. Very similar to how the Baltic states were until 1991, when they recovered their independence. Nobody in those days thought that the Estonians, the Latvians, the Lithuanians were a Russian minority. So why do we call the Tibetans a minority of China? We should remind people that the Tibetans are a people, they're a country, they're an occupied state, and that's a completely different status. It has completely different consequences also in international law than being a minority. There's nothing wrong in being a minority, but it is a different category and it has different consequences. One of them, of course, being that a people has the right to self-determination, a minority not necessarily. But that's just one of the consequences. So our research really had two elements, two questions that we were trying to answer. The first was, how do you understand, how do you interpret the different perceptions of historical relations in Asia today? In other words, how do you explain why the Chinese, the Tibetans, the Mongolians, the Uyghurs, the Russians, the Indians, and others have different ways of understanding his history in the past? This is not exceptional. I mean, it's not just in Asia that there's these different perceptions of history. It happens in many places. And because Mick Boltjes and I had been working for about 25 years and perhaps longer in another way, in conflicts in different parts of the world, in particular conflicts between a population group and the state of which they're a part or they've been made a part, we had noticed that in many of these conflicts, there are very conflicting perceptions of their past history, and that makes resolving those conflicts very difficult. And we know that with Tibet and China, this is very much the case. So we wanted to understand why that happens. And so we looked at the history of Inner Asia and East Asia since the time with Genghis Khan in the 13th century to the present time, and looked at how these relations developed, what their nature was, etc., and how they were interpreted by the different players at the time. And we worked with, for both books, ultimately with about 100 top scholars around the world, seminars, university seminars in these different places, to understand from people who are specialists in Mongolian sources, in Tibetan sources, in Chinese sources, in Manchu sources, in Korean sources, in Iranians, from different perspectives. A long journey. And the first thing that came out was the first book, which is a more academic book called Sacred Mandates, Asian International Relations since Genghis Khan. Then we wanted to answer the question, is it true then, based on this new knowledge that we had, that Tibet was a part of China at some point in history? And how did that happen? And what are the consequences of that for today? And again, we worked for a number of years on that with the help of scholars in different parts of the world. And we came to the conclusion that the answer to that question is actually a lot simpler than we thought. And it is that Tibet was in fact historically never a part of China. That this is a big misunderstanding, helped by China's disinformation, but also already originating in a over-reliance on Chinese, on the Chinese worldview. We have been influenced very much already in the past by scholars that had studied Chinese sources and interpreted Asian history from the perspective of those Chinese sources, as opposed to looking at other sources and giving them equal importance. That's just one aspect of it. But the Chinese disinformation campaign really, for political reasons, really kind of eradicated very important parts of history and interpretations of history, and replaced them by an ideological approach that really in part falsifies and in part simply misinterprets history for political objectives. So we came to the conclusion that in fact Tibet was never a part of China. And that doesn't mean it was always independent in the modern legal sense of the term, an independent state the way we know states today and since the beginning of the 20th century. In Asia, relations were different. Political entities were different than the modern state, the modern, what is called nation state. So they were different. Tibet came at times under the influence or authority of the Mongols, when the Mongol Empire was at its greatest extent. Also under a special relationship and political influence of the Manchu, who ruled a large part of Asia, and under influence of the British in the more recent history. But never was Tibet a part of China. And that is precisely what the strange thing is, that China only claims that Tibet was part of China. It doesn't really recognize any of these other relationships that Tibet had. And in the last 40 years before China's invasion of Tibet, Tibet was an independent state in the modern legal sense of the term. As independent as the Baltic states were before they were invaded by the Soviet Union in 1949, very close to the time Tibet was invaded by China. They had the same status. And so Tibet's occupied status today is very similar to the occupied status of the Baltic states before they became independent, or the status of East Timor before it became independent in 2001. 2001. So that was the result of our research. And interestingly, as an anecdote, I just was before coming to Germany, I was in Estonia for a hearing at the Estonian Parliament on the status of Tibet. And with me was also a Chinese scholar, a Chinese professor, Professor Lau, who has just published an enormous book in Chinese, which will be translated in English, an enormous book in Chinese based only on Chinese language imperial sources, going through the same period of time that we've done the research, from Genghis Khan or not Genghis Khan, in his case, it's the beginning of the Yuan dynasty, which it came later, to the Republican time, the Republic of China time. And he's trying to answer the same question: was Tibet a part of China, and when did it become a part of China? And using only Chinese sources, and then only those sources, those imperial histories and geographies that were authoritative, in other words, published by the order of the emperor, or some governmental institution at the time, and republished by the People's Republic of China, so that it cannot deny the legitimacy of those sources, he comes to exactly the same conclusion. He doesn't look at Tibetan sources, Mongolian sources, Korean sources. He looks only at Chinese language sources and comes to the same conclusion. That was remarkable to me, because I would have thought that looking only at Chinese sources, you would come to a different conclusion, but he didn't. And so I think we can say with a great degree of confidence that we have misunderstood the relationship between Tibet and China in the past. And that since that was so much reinforced by Chinese propaganda, today many people are unclear about it. And even government officials that are specialized in relations with China and so forth also tell me that, well, you know, I'm sure there's some truth in this notion that Tibet was part of China at some point in history. It simply isn't true. And the best way to find out is to ask somebody, well, how did Tibet become a part of China then? And when did that happen? Because you don't just become part of something without some event happening. There's a conquest, there has to be a government that takes control, there has to be something. You have to have some evidence that you're paying taxes to the government that you're supposed to be part of, something, right? It doesn't exist in the case of Tibet. And so I think this is important, but it's particularly important today because it means that that the way in which our governments are behaving towards Tibet, but also towards the Sino-Tibetan conflict, does not correspond to the way they should according to their obligations, according to international law. As I just mentioned earlier, states are not permitted to recognize a forceful annexation of another state. And so when our governments make statements that they consider that Tibet is part of China, they're actually violating international law each time they do it. And this is not just important out of a principle. International law is not just about principles. It's about our rules-based order that we created after the First and Second World War. And if we ourselves undermine international law, then we are helping China, which is on a path to try to undo the international legal order that exists today and transform it more towards its objectives, towards its benefit. And that is something that most states do not want. And yet, by not abiding by some of these fundamental rules of international law, we are in fact undermining our own legal order as well. And so there's a cost to be paid for that. The cost of appeasement of China over Tibet is already apparent. We're already paying for that in a number of ways. We've created a bully that is getting away with things that are damaging others. I mean, today's China's behavior in the South China Sea, its destruction or erosion of the autonomy that it guaranteed for Hong Kong, its aggressive behavior towards Taiwan, its increasingly assertive behavior in terms of territorial claims in northern India, vast territories in northern India that it claims belong to China. It's changing even the names of the villages in India to Chinese names on its maps to prove the point that it's Chinese ownership. All these things are, at least in part, the result of having appeased China all these years on Tibet and not making China accountable for its invasion and aggression of Tibet. And so we're already paying the price for that. And if we continue to appease China there or elsewhere, it will only make it increase the price. I mean, let's not kid ourselves. China's claims to all these territories I mentioned are based on the same fundamentals of the historical narrative that it is using for claiming that Tibet's part of China. And so we cannot say, oh no, the South China Sea is not part of China, or Taiwan should not be taken back by China, or northern India is not part of China, if we accept the historical narrative that Tibet was and is part of China. Because the fundamentals of those narratives are the same. And of course, in respect to northern India, it's an immediate relationship because the border that China disputes between Arunachal Pradesh province or state of India and Tibet, that border was demarcated in a treaty between Tibet and India. So you cannot say Tibet was not independent or didn't have the right to make a border treaty, which is an obvious sign of independence of sovereignty, because ceding territory is really a sovereign act, and at the same time say that Tibet's part of China today. Those two things are not possible. And so India understands this very well. Other countries further away may not understand it as well. But for India, this is an important conflict. It's a conflict that they are faced with every day, with 70,000 troops of Chinese army on their borders, 70,000 troops of their own also on the border, facing each other. This is a very dangerous situation. The two most populous countries in the world facing each other on a border, both nuclear powers, with another nuclear power right next door, is dangerous. And it is not for nothing that before that, Tibet always played the role of a buffer state between big powers. And that has been taken away by Chinese invasion of Tibet, creating this danger, which we may see the consequence of before too long. Then there's another line of thinking that is equally important, and that is that the nature of Chinese rule in Tibet. The nature of Chinese rule in Tibet is classical colonial rule. All the aspects of this rule, the ideologies, the way in which Tibetans are viewed by the Chinese, not just by the Chinese government, but by Chinese people as well, because of the ideology that has been, because of their education, because of what they're being taught in school, is colonial. The exploitation of the resources is colonial. The justification for being there to help Tibetans raise them from backwardness, to educate them, to develop their level of culture, to improve their economic situation. All of these things, I come from a former colonial power, the Netherlands. All the rationalizations for being in Indonesia as a colonial power were the same. We were helping the Indonesians. And every colonial power did this. They either had a religious ideology, we're helping them because we're bringing in Christianity, we're helping them because we're putting toilets, we're helping them because we're building infrastructure. There's always been this kind of ideological justification for colonialism. The only reason we haven't called China's rule in Tibet colonial is because China has very actively used its victimhood of colonialism in the past as a shield from ever being called colonial or imperialist. And we have felt in the West guilty feelings being colonial powers in the past and have therefore gone along with this narrative. We have not dared to challenge this narrative. I remember even at the United Nations in I think it was 89 or the early 90s or something, when I spoke at that time it was called the Human Rights Commission on Tibet, that the response from the Chinese government delegation to what I had said was to accuse me as a citizen of a former colonial power of saying certain things. In other words, playing that role that what I was trying to do was to somehow, as a former colonial, take back some of the influence that colonial powers had in the past in Asia. And the consequence of this colonial type rule, or not the consequence, the definition of it is that Tibetans are under the definition of international law and of the way the United Nations has expressed it, that Tibetans are a people under subjugation, alien subjugation, domination, and exploitation. That is the definition of colonialism from a legal point of view. There's no denial that Tibetans are under alien subjugation. They have been subjugated by an alien power. There is no question that Tibetans are being dominated by this alien power. And there's no question that Tibet is being exploited. That's a little bit more of a difficult question because, yes, China is exploiting the natural resources and exploiting Tibet in other ways, political ways, strategic ways, etc. But it claims that it is putting a tremendous amount of money and subsidy in Tibet. But again, this is very often the case in colonial territories. I mean, especially in some cases near the end of the colonial period, a lot of subsidies go into a colonial territory that is no longer functioning well, and it's not exceptional. So the consequence of that again is that since Tibetans are unquestionably a people under international law, not a minority, a people, and that they're under alien subjugation, domination, and exploitation, or one of those three, they have the right to self-determination, the full right to self-determination, which means that you have the right to choose your own status, your economic, cultural, social development, free of foreign interference. This is the definition of self-determination. And so it can be that you decide that you want to be a part of China, it can be that you decide you want to be autonomous, it can be that you decide to be associated with a different country, with India, for example, and it can be that you want to be independent. And that is your right. The reason I'm saying this is because I think there's been some confusion about that, and among Tibetans there's been confusion about whether having dialogue with China, which is what the middle way approach is, the official policy of the Tibetan government in exile, and self-determination or independence, if these are all mutually exclusive, that there are choices you need to make. that it's a false concept, it's a false question. It isn't a choice you have to make. Self-determination is itself says you can choose any of these things. And dialogue is simply a process towards finding a solution. The outcome of that, whether it is the kind of autonomy that the Tibetan government has proposed to China, and which China has not accepted, is just one possible outcome. Also, what is often misunderstood when I say some of these things to some government officials or parliamentarians, they will say, yes, no, but the Dalai Lama doesn't want independence. So what is this? Why is it important to mention that Tibet is an occupied state or that it was independent? We need to look at the future, and the Dalai Lama has said, we're not asking for independence, we're only asking for genuine autonomy. Well, Tibetans have made a proposal for genuine autonomy, very detailed. The memorandum that was given to the Chinese government in 2008 is very detailed, and the Chinese have rejected it. When you make a proposal as part of a dialogue and negotiation process, you don't give up your rights before the other one has accepted what you want in exchange for giving up your rights. It's a package. Sure, if China accepts this kind of autonomy with safeguards, with the right of Tibetans to decide on almost everything, according to this proposal, on almost everything except defense and foreign affairs, Tibetans may be prepared to say, all right, from now on, we will be part of the People's Republic of China. But Tibetans haven't given up anything until such time as there is an agreement that both sides feel comfortable about. So that, I think, is a great misunderstanding. That just because somebody has said we're prepared to accept something, that you've already given up your rights, your independence, your right to self-determination. This is not the case. It has not been done. And so what I'm asking many governments to do also is not to do anything that takes away or harms the Tibetans' rights and their status. If they can't do more than that, at least do that. Don't make a statement that Tibet's part of China, because that gives China the perception that it has legitimacy in Tibet, and it uses that to claim that it is legitimate. You can see it in the white books that China releases and in their statements. They literally say, other governments are saying that Tibet's part of China, therefore it's part of China. So we are giving them the argument that they cannot legitimately state on themselves, because the only legitimacy they can have is either historical, which is what they claim, but China doesn't claim any other legitimacy, only historical. It doesn't say we're in Tibet because of, that Tibet belongs to China because it came in with the army and it's controlling Tibet. No, it says it's because it's always been part of China. So there was no aggression. There was no invasion. So if that doesn't stand, then China has no legitimacy in Tibet at all. And so we shouldn't be trying to give China legitimacy. So that is causing harm. And it's causing harm also because, it's policy in the European Union and of most governments, including the German government, to support a negotiated or a peaceful resolution to the Tibet-China conflict. Many governments have made statements and saying we support dialogue as a way to resolve this. We support the middle way. But they're actually undermining that policy by making statements like Tibet is part of China, and some governments have even said, and we oppose independence of Tibet. I mean, who has the right to take away a right of Tibetans and to say, I oppose Tibetans becoming independent? Who would have liked it if the international community would have said, we oppose Germany reuniting. It's nobody's right except the people themselves to decide whether they want to give up independence, whether they want to unite, etc. And so, it's harmful in and of itself to make these kinds of statements or actions that imply this kind of recognition, but also it takes away the only incentive that the leaders of the People's Republic of China have to negotiate with Tibetans. Because the Chinese leadership knows very well that they lack legitimacy in Tibet. This is not us saying it. They know it very well. Why else would they need everybody else to say that Tibet's part of China? Why do they demand that the Dalai Lama make a statement, a public statement, that Tibet is part of China and has been part of China since antiquity, if it was true that it was? And if they didn't want the legitimacy from the Dalai Lama, from the Tibetan people, for their presence in Tibet. And so by us giving them a semblance of legitimacy, we're taking away the need for them to go to Tibetans and negotiate and give something in return for that legitimacy. So we're undermining our own policy of supporting dialogue and a peaceful resolution of the Tibetan-Chinese conflict. And that, I think, is very serious. And talking to government officials in a number of countries, I think making this point is coming home. They are understanding it. They are starting to change their behavior. And I think you will see more and more that that is happening. Now, I don't know that whether you will see it publicly, whether there will be a public change of policy, maybe not. But I think that I'm hoping that they will start not doing too many things that harm the Tibetan position. And that at this point is all I'm asking them to do. There will be other things they need to do later if the situation in the world changes. But this, I think, is fundamental. And I think that's essentially what I wanted to share with you. I think it is important to remind our governments and our parliamentarians and so on of the reality of the situation, of the duties that we have as internationals, as countries and as international as citizens of the world. It's not just a moral duty, it is a moral duty, but it is also a legal duty and a political duty. We also need to make them aware of not just, for a long time Tibet has been associated with His Holiness, with Tibetan Buddhism, with Tibetan culture. All this is true, all this is important. It's been associated with the human rights violations, extremely important. We need to do something about human rights, but it's a political issue. Tibet is not just these things that I've mentioned. Tibet is a country that's been invaded. It's a political issue. It needs a political solution, and the international community has a responsibility to find or to help find this solution. And this is not just in the interest of the Tibetans. It's in the interest of the community, a much wider community. India has an interest in this. I mean, the Indian people. But also, increasingly, you notice that people in Mongolia are being put under a lot of pressure by China, and they need this resolved as well. For people in South Asia and Southeast Asia, they rely on water from Tibet for their livelihood, and China has announced its plans to divert water from Tibet to its own needs in China, which is going to take away water from Southeast Asia and from South Asia. So so there is not just a moral and philosophical reason to help Tibetans to find a solution to this. There is also a very strategic and a very human need for the region to find a solution to this. So it's not ideological. It is a realpolitik need to start seeing the reality and to respond to it in cooperation with the countries of that region. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael, for your presentation, for your all about that, your tireless support for the cause of Tibet, but also the Tibetan people. And thank you for this tool, I would say. For me as a Tibetan or having a Tibetan background, I feel like this is a tool we got from you, which is helping us to go on with the struggle and probably, as you said, be prepared for the moment when change is happening. And that is very, very helpful for us. Also, I have listened to your talks already more often before, and there were like these 3 points which I try to keep reminding myself like a mantra as well, because the Chinese narrative and propaganda is so strong. So like Tibet was never a part of China, Tibetans are not a minority, and Tibet was occupied in the violation of international law. And I feel like even for me, working in this official status from Tibet Initiative Germany, even for myself, sometimes it's hard to find a balance, or I would say it's even tempting to use Chinese narratives because it's so common all over. And I wanted to ask you if there is anything else we should be aware of not using, saying in our daily life, because I think language is also a very important tool.
Well, you've already mentioned the terminology of minority, which I think is something, ethnic group or religious group. I think it's something to stay away from and to really call Tibetans what they are, a people, a country, occupied state. Other things are, and it's very common for people to have adopted the Chinese way of looking at the rulers of China over history. And it's fine for Chinese people to use their own construct of history, just as everybody uses their own construct of history to explain and to understand their history. So the Chinese have this system of dynasties that all succeed each other seamlessly. One follows the other because the mandate of heaven is given from one to the other, etc. Well, Tibetans have a different, the idea of reincarnation is a Tibetan construct to understand things philosophically and religiously. Everybody has their own ways of looking at things. But one of the consequences of this Chinese way of explaining history is that they transform any ruler that rules the Chinese as being Chinese. So suddenly the Yuan dynasty is a Chinese dynasty, and what is ruling is called China. And the Manchu dynasty, which is Manchu, an inner Asian people related to the Mongols, related to the Koreans, becomes a Chinese dynasty. And their state is called China for some reason. Okay, it may explain it for them, for Chinese people, so they never have to learn that they were occupied for centuries. In the last 1,000 years, China was ruled by occupation empire, by a foreign empire, more than it ruled themselves. And I think that's important for us to understand, but it actually would be extremely important for the Chinese to understand that they're like anybody else in the world. They've had their times of ruling others, they've had their times of being ruled by others. This is normal, this is history. It would be bizarre if it wasn't the case for the Chinese. And yet they have this myth that China as a state existed for thousands of years. Of course, Chinese culture did, and it changed over time and all that. And many cultures did. But yeah, Chinese culture existed for a long time. Chinese people existed for a long time. But the Chinese state didn't exist all this time. There were different states that followed. Sometimes they became, like with the Mongols, they became part of the Mongolian Empire. The Yuan dynasty was the name that the Mongolians gave to that portion of the empire that ruled the Chinese. And they used the Chinese system of rule and administration to rule the Chinese because that's the way to do it. That's a very clever way of doing it. They used an Islamic system to rule the Persians. They used a Christian system and Muslim to rule Russia. In other words, they used the Buddhist system to rule in large parts of inner Asia. So to call the Yuan dynasty a Chinese dynasty, and then to say that because Tibetans came under the overlordship of Mongolians, of the great Khan of the Mongols, that therefore Tibet became a part of China, is completely absurd. And yet, we, and I mean generally in the West, we've kind of accepted that. We also talk about the Yuan dynasty and Tibet's relationship with the Yuan dynasty. Tibet had a relationship with the great Khan of the Mongols, not with the Chinese dynasty. Wasn't part of the administration of China. It was kept separate. And the relationship was separate. Same with the Manchus. In fact, and this is an interesting detail, but it is interesting. The Manchus were very conscious that when ruling the Chinese and when exerting influence over East Asia, Vietnam, Korea, that hardly had any over Japan, but it was in that same, Japan followed the same cynic view of the world, that they needed to act as the Huangdi, as the emperor of China and as the son of heaven, which meant that they were at the top of the hierarchy in the world. That was the construct. Fair enough. But the Manchu emperors had a different relationship with the Mongols than they had with the Chinese. They did not rule the Mongols through this Chinese system of being the emperor. They were the great Khan of the Mongols. They were the successors of Genghis Khan. They received the statue of Mahakala that the Tibetans had given to Kublai Khan, and that was kind of the transfer of the authority of the great Khan to the Manchu emperors. So towards the Mongolians, they were part of the Mongol world, and the great Khan had nothing to do with their rule of China. In fact, the Mongols very much helped the Manchus and were part of the armed force that the Manchus used to occupy China. In every major Chinese area, there was a big garrison of Manchus and Mongols, and some Chinese of the north that had joined them. With the Tibetans, the Manchu emperor had a Tibetan Buddhist relationship that had nothing to do with the Chinese system. And it had to do with disciple and Lama, disciple and guru relationship. That had political connotations, no question. Protection, which meant sending an army if the Tibetans asked for it. Sending money to monasteries, the way that this happens in the relationship between disciples and gurus or lamas. But the interesting detail is that in order not to lose legitimacy vis-à-vis their Chinese subjects and the East Asian world, the Manchus kept their relationship with the Tibetans, the nature of their relationship with the Tibetans, with the Tibetan lamas, secret from the Chinese officials, Chinese people in the court, even their most close Chinese administrators of China. So those communications, for example, with lamas and with others and with the Tibetan government, were in Manchu or in Mongol language, not in Chinese, so that the Chinese wouldn't be able to read it. Because they were relationships that involved equality between the emperor and the highest lamas. They involved devotion to the lama. Things which, if they had been translated in Chinese, would have somehow taken away the myth that the Manchu is at the top of the pinnacle of the world, because there were also some relationship of equality. And so you find that, for example, references to imperial representatives kowtowing to, or they call it kowtowing, but it's prostrating before a Panchen Lama or Dalai Lama, were refuted by the emperor in his Chinese language communication, saying you can't do this, but in fact saying this is how you have to behave in the Manchu and the Mongol. So these are very important things, because then you realize there were those relations that were completely separate and kept secret. And it's not unique to the Tibetan situation. One very good example that is very revealing is that the early treaties between the Manchu emperor or his court and Russia were also kept secret from the Chinese court officials. Those treaties were only done in Manchu language, in Latin, and in Russian, so that the Chinese court officials wouldn't realize that those treaties were made among equals, two equal powers, because that would have again defeated this idea of legitimacy. So it was not just with Tibetans, it was just the standard practice of the Manchu rulers to keep everybody in their own, to deal with everybody in their own sphere and according to their own constructs of how the world was formed. And that's something I think that is not known, not really understood widely at all. But it's fundamental to understanding Tibet's relationship with the Manchus, and to therefore understanding that even during that time, Tibet was not part of China. And its relationship was simply a separate relationship with the emperor and with the court. And that China was not China then, it was the Qing state. And just as some government official told me actually yesterday, and it really rang a bell. He told me that Germany did not recognize either the Republic of China or the People's Republic of China until later. But they had never, in fact, recognized the Republic of China. So I was surprised. And then this person said, no, but I'm talking about the German state, which was created after the Second World War. This is a separate state. It's a new state. And this is exactly the same with the Republic of China. The Republic of China was a new state. It's not the successor. It's not the continuation of the Manchu Empire or the continuation of the Ming or the continuation of anything. It is a new state. And so once the Manchu Empire ceased to exist, any connection with Tibet ended. The new state, the Republic of China, would then have had to create a new relationship with Tibet, if it wanted to. And in fact, it wanted to. The Republic claimed that Tibet was part of China for some aspirational reason, and the new president of the new Chinese state insisted and wrote to both the Dalai Lama and to the Jetsun Dampa in Mongolia, the head of state of Mongolia, to please join the Republic. Please join the Republic. Both of them refused, said, no, we're not going to join the Republic. We're independent. So the notion that somehow the Republic of China inherited Tibet from somebody before is also needs to be debunked. Sorry, I'm talking much too much. Not enough time for questions.
Thank you. No, it's fascinating listening to you and learning from our history from you, which is also, yeah, it's somehow sad for us that we don't have the option as well sometimes, but to know all this, and that's why I'm also saying thank you for your work in the name of all the Tibetans. But I would like to ask the audience if you have any questions to Michael van Walt. Also online, if you want, please share your questions with us. We have some time left. And yeah, Marek.
First of all, thank you very much for your presentation. It was really informative. My question is, do you think the scenario would be realistic that the Chinese government creates a Chinese majority in Tibet and then calls for a referendum for its status?
So I quickly recap the question so that our online audience can hear you clearly. So the question was if this scenario is realistic that China could wie hast du es gesagt? Create a Chinese majority inside Tibet to change the status of Tibet.
Well, it's a very common. It's happened a number of times that, again, mostly in colonial countries or in territories that have been occupied by a foreign power, that power moves its population to the territory that it has conquered or occupied, and does exactly that. Either just creates a new status quo, a new de facto situation, or agrees to a referendum. I mean, I'm sure you've all followed what happened with the Moroccan invasion of Western Sahara, then moved Moroccans into Western Sahara when the United Nations called for a referendum, and then wants, of course, these Moroccan settlers to be also voting in such a referendum. Situation isn't resolved yet, but that issue has become or became quite an important controversy. Who was then supposed to vote? We see also in New Caledonia, that was and is still a French colony, although it is called overseas territory, that they've recently had 3 referenda in which the population of the islands vote, and they're not just the indigenous population but also the French settlers that have settled there over a very long time. In the Baltic states, the referenda that were held in 1991 was also the entire population, not just the Estonians, the Latvians, the Lithuanians, but also the Russians. Now, in those cases, most of the Russians voted in favor of independence, which is also interesting. So it can, the outcome is never quite clear how it would turn out. But there are precedents for saying that there has to be a certain delimitation in terms of who votes and who doesn't. And it's generally not on ethnic lines. But for example, everybody who settled or who was living in Tibet before a certain date, whether you're Tibetan or Chinese or anybody else, should be allowed to vote. And determining when that date is becomes then very important and sometimes controversial. But it is not an entirely unrealistic approach. If you think in terms of that referenda are an issue, you may also remember that Mongolia, of course, declared its independence already in 1911, but it wasn't until agreement between Joseph Stalin and Mao Zedong, Chiang Kai-shek, after the Second World War in 1945, that Chiang Kai-shek's government, the Kuomintang government, agreed to recognize Mongolia's independence, but only on condition that there would be a referendum in Mongolia. And the referendum was held, and 98% or something voted for independence. And then the Kuomintang government recognized Mongolia as an independent state. Then a few years later, they went back on it. So for a long time after that, they claimed Mongolia was a part of China, and I think in some of the maps only recently still of the government in Taiwan, Mongolia was still seen as part of China. I think that has changed now, but yeah. So it is not entirely unrealistic. Yeah. And the movement of Chinese into Tibet is a serious concern, and is, by the way, a violation of international law, because there is a prohibition, clear prohibition in international law of transfer of population into occupied territory. You're not allowed to send your people into an occupied territory.
We got a question on YouTube, which is actually just about the same topic, asking if you know how many people are still escaping from Tibet to Dharamsala or in exile, was by months or weeks, and if you have any numbers between how the ratio is between Tibetan and Chinese in Tibet people. Tibetan.
Both, well, the first question, how many people are escaping, I don't know the exact numbers. I do know that it is very few. In other words, the more the Chinese government has secured the border and made it impossible for people even to move within Tibet from one place to another, the more difficult it becomes for people to escape. And in the past, it was easier for Tibetans to go to Nepal and India, and then some of them, and they went even sometimes, they went legally. They were allowed to leave. They were given a passport and allowed to leave for some purpose, for a visit with relatives or other things, and then they stayed. They didn't go back. And people were just fleeing across the border, and it was still possible, even though it was very difficult. Today, it's almost impossible to cross that border. And so that is why we're seeing very few Tibetans able to escape from Tibet. In terms of the ratio of Chinese and Tibetans in Tibet itself, it's very difficult to say. I mean, it varies very much from region to region. In the very east of Tibet, in Kham region, there have been Chinese living there for a very long time already. And so the increase in Chinese population there went much faster than it did in, for example, central Tibet, which the Chinese call Tibet Autonomous Region. Again, in certain parts of Amdo, there had traditionally been a mix of populations, for example, in the big city of Jining, and there is more Chinese than Tibetans. But in other areas there aren't. There's far more Tibetans than Chinese. In rural areas, generally, there's more Tibetans. In the cities, there's more Chinese. And the more the Chinese have built infrastructure into Tibet, railway, roads, buildings, economic opportunities, the more Chinese move into Tibet. But I think we have to be aware that not all Chinese who are in Tibet are there as permanent settlers. There are permanent settlers, but there are many who move into Tibet for business reasons, may stay there for part of the year and live at home in whatever province they come from in China for the other part of the year. And so they're not necessarily a permanent part of the population of Tibet. They're there for business purposes.
Thank you. Any more questions?
Did you hear about crossing the border to Mustang? They have a new possibility to cross, and I wonder about the Tibetans to come to Mustang. I know the Nepalese are going to Tibet, that's for sure.
No, I don't know if that's a new possibility. I know that the highway was built to Mustang, which is open Mustang on the Tibetan side of Mustang. I don't know whether that is a positive development or a negative development ultimately for Mustang, for the people of Mustang, but that has happened there, yes. But I don't know what that means for Tibetans, whether it makes it any easier for Tibetans to move. I do know that some now, very recently, the Chinese government has allowed some Tibetan groups to visit Nepal, but under surveillance, in other words, with Chinese minders who travel with them and control their every move. The group has to stay together. They can't just go and visit relatives. They can't go and talk to other Tibetans in Nepal. They have to use the telephones, the cell telephones that they use in Tibet. In other words, they can't buy new cell phones so that they would be able to call somebody without it being monitored. There's all kinds of rules that make it impossible for them to leave the group and to communicate with people other than those that are approved by their Chinese minders. But this is a new development. So there are now some Tibetans that are permitted to go out, but they're under very strict guard, and of course they have to go back.
Yeah, one more question.
Yeah, I'm curious to hear what the League of Nations, how they treated Tibet in their times.
The question is how the League of Nations treated Tibet. Tibet at that time, so we're talking between the two world wars, did not make an effort to become part of the League of Nations, just as they were very late in realizing that they should become a part of the United Nations. So Tibet was ruled by both a religious and secular elite that was very isolationist, that saw much of the outside world more as a danger to the established order in Tibet than anything else, that only wanted relations with other Tibetan Buddhist countries and not outsiders, if you like, and that ultimately harmed Tibet, I think, in terms of not having had the kind of international relations, membership of the League of Nations or the UN that would have given it perhaps some protection. But that was the way it was at the time. This is the way that the people in power felt about international relations. The 13th Dalai Lama warned them, and Tibetans in general, about this kind of attitude and the dangers of it. And one of the things he also warned them about was that they needed an army, and they needed to strengthen it, and they needed relations. He had the experience of living in Mongolia, of traveling to Beijing, to the court, Manchu court, and having conversations with diplomats from many countries. He asked the German government for weapons. The Germans said, well, maybe you should ask the Russians. The Russians didn't supply them either. And then when he went into exile in India in 1909 to 1913, or to 1912, he had very intense relations with British officials, so he had a view of the world that was different from the Tibetans who had never left Lhasa, or hardly left Lhasa. And so he knew that it was necessary in a modern world to change the way you related with others. But unfortunately, he was not able to bring about this change in time.
We have one last question online. Do you think that the coercive boarding schools in Tibet could be termed as genocide under the Genocide Convention?
Tell me again.
Do you think that the coercive boarding schools in Tibet could be termed genocide under the Genocide Convention?
Oh, the schools you're referring to, the colonial boarding schools, are again a fairly, I don't want to use the word common, but there are many instances in the past of colonial powers doing just that. We have heard about them in Canada. It has that exact same practice that was done with Indigenous people in Canada, children from First Nations by the colonial government of Canada, and then later the Canadian government itself, or institutions of it, and church institutions have been called genocidal by the Canadian authorities today. In other words, there's a recognition that that is genocidal. But you know, in Australia, the same was done with Aboriginals of Australia. The same was done in the United States, I believe, with Indigenous people there. But it's not just with Indigenous people. In many countries, this was done as part of a colonial policy, or as part of a religious a zeal to convert people. So it's not new. It's like following the book. Is it genocide? It is clearly genocidal. It's clearly part of a pattern that you see in genocide that includes, in other words, destroying, eliminating the distinctiveness of a people or a culture or their culture, and their identity, and that is clearly the intention currently of the policy in China. Other aspects of other genocidal policies are trying to reduce or considerably the birth rate of a particular group of people that is being targeted, and then just destroying their identity. In other words, for genocide to exist, and this is a misconception I think that sometimes exists, for genocide to exist, you do not to have mass killings of that population group. You can it is about the extinction of that population group as a people, as a cultural identity, as a religious group. And I think that is happening in Tibet, just as it's happening to the Uyghurs in eastern Turkestan, which Chinese call Xinjiang.
Thank you very much. Oh, one last question. Yeah, please.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for spending your time with us. It's a great honor for us to have you with us and sharing your hard work that you have done to find out the facts about Tibet. And I, being a Tibetan, I'm very proud of you having on our board. And I would like to thank you from my bottom of my heart for all these hardships that you have taken to reveal the facts about Tibet. Now, my question is, having found all these facts, and we Tibetans have been shouting and trying to tell the world that Tibet hasn't been a part of China, and still the international community has been somewhat like, ignoring or not supporting the cause of Tibet because of the ongoing economic power of China. So since we have been struggling all the time with these facts, and you have brought these facts on the international platform, do you think that is there any other ways? Because we Tibetans are somewhat like running out of ways to bring these facts on the international community, that the international community could help us more and more clearly. They could give a signal to the Chinese government that Tibet wasn't a part of China and Tibet should be an independent country. So is there any ways or methods that we could convince the international community and convince the Chinese that the Tibet wasn't a part of China and Tibet should be an independent country?
Let me just say one thing. I don't want to be misunderstood. And I've mentioned this to people who think that my point in saying all these things that I've said and all these arguments is to say that Tibet must be independent. It's not for me to say whether Tibet should be independent, autonomous, part of China, not part of China. That's for Tibetans to decide. So I don't take a position on that. I take a position that the Tibetans have the right to decide, and that they must be given the opportunity to exercise that right. And then it's for Tibetans to decide what is the best status for them to take. Now, having said that, yes, the way that you put the question leads me to this answer, which is, I think it is very important, and it's time for Tibetans no longer to... Firstly, it's important that Tibetans know their history and feel confident about it. So I really urge you to read my book and any other books that you think and find out more so that you really feel confident. Because I think there has been a lack of self-confidence when it comes to your history, and for very good reasons. Because of the propaganda, because there hasn't been enough information out there, perhaps not described in a simple enough manner. I mean, it's a lot of reasons, but there's a lot of self-doubt. Many Tibetans talk about Tibetan relations with China when they mean with the Qing dynasty, for example, or with the Manchus. And it just slips in because it's so easy to think of it as having been Chinese, whereas it actually was Manchu. So there's a lot of confusion there. So self-confidence is very important. But I think today it is important for Tibetans no longer to be asking for help, but to consider themselves and consider that Tibet is entitled to certain things because of your status, because of your rights, but also because you can be partners with other countries in finding solutions to problems that are important to other countries as well. And I've mentioned a few of them. but you can be part of a solution of other world issues and therefore play that role of seeking partnerships as opposed to only seeking help as a victim of China's oppression. And that may change the dynamic somewhat. And it's not just for individuals, I think it's also the Tibetan government in exile. It is changing that psychological dynamic, which perhaps can help. I don't know if it will, but perhaps it can. And seeking alliances with other like-minded, I mean, for example, some people see what is happening today with the growth of authoritarianism, with more impunity in terms of how states act than was the case a number of years ago, as a kind of struggle between democracies or democratic values and authoritarianism or even fascist values. If you choose the side of the democratic struggle in this case, for example, then you have many allies. But then you are contributing to that struggle, or you're contributing to strengthening those values. And that will create alliances for you with governments, with civil society, with other oppressed people, recognize their problems as being yours as well. And I think that may help also create a stronger feeling. Speaking up more, for example, for the Ukraine as Tibet, as Tibetans, is also helpful because it shows you you identify with them because you're going through the same kind of suffering. That may be reciprocated at some point. Today, of course, the Ukraine is being very careful because it doesn't want to, it needs China in the UN and elsewhere to also perhaps find an end to the war. But that doesn't mean that they wouldn't acknowledge your solidarity at some point. Remember that His Holiness was one of the first people who spoke out very openly at the time that the Baltic states were starting to resist the Soviets in the 89, 90, when before and when the Berlin Wall fell. As a result, Landsbergis, who became the first president of Lithuania, invited His Holiness the Dalai Lama as the first foreign guest to Lithuania, officially to the parliament, to thank him for his support. And that was a very important gesture. And it wasn't Dalai Lama as Dalai Lama. He was very conscious that it was Tibet that he was inviting. Václav Havel did the same thing. And so they might have not been able to show it at the time that they were struggling, but once they were in a position of more comfort, they were able to show their gratitude. And I think that is important.
Thank you very much for your time being here in Berlin as well. We really hope that we can welcome you soon again. I want to emphasize again, there is the book, which is coming out in German very soon as well, Tibet erklärt in Deutsch. But we also, if you want to know more about Michael Walt van Praag, we have our magazine Brennpunkt Tibet with a very long interview with you in it. And at the end, I would like to invite my colleague Pamela to the front. We organized this event together with the Tibetan community in Berlin, and she would like to give some last words to you, and thank you. Yeah.
So? Yeah, thank you so much, Michael. Yeah, my name is Pema, and I'm from the Tibetan community in Berlin. And we are so honored to have you here today. And it was a pleasure listening to your talk, very informative. And first of all, I would like to thank you for your long-standing support of Tibet and Tibetan people. And you might have heard this a lot from Tibetan all over the world. We really appreciate that you decided to write this research book and also publish this book, Tibet 2020. And I think this book has now become an important tool or important resource for Tibetan people and also supporter of Tibet, filled with your vast research material, historical facts, as well as like the legal insights for our fight. And your book has strengthened our case for an independent Tibet, that Tibet never was a part of China. It was a sovereign state. And this has given us, all the Tibetans, especially the younger generation, a really sense of confidence in for the righteousness of our fight for an independent Tibet. So thank you so much. And on a personal level, I've been listening to your talks in Dharamsala recently, and one of the things that really resonated with me is how important use of certain terms or languages when we talk about Tibet with other people. And you also mentioned that terms like Tibetan issues or like Tibetan, referring to Tibetans as minority inside China, how detrimental that is for our case in legal terms. And that kind of makes a lot of sense. And I think as we all know, Tibetans know in our heart, and as you've established in your book, that Tibet never was under China, and but Tibetan people are oppressed people occupied by China. So this is for us, for Tibetans as well as Tibetan support group, to be wary and to keep in mind when we speak about Tibet with other people, and because most of the people kind of inadvertently repeat what is common and which is unfortunately the narrative put forward by the China at this moment. So as an activist and Tibetan, we need to be wary and push back on those narratives and set our own narratives. And your book has been a really help as a tool to fight against these narratives. And yeah, thank you so much for your time here today. And as a token of our appreciation, I would like to present you a katha. And I really advise, or I wish all the Tibetans or anybody interested in Tibet and Tibetan freedom struggle to get a copy of the book, Tibet 2020. And I'm so glad that this is also going to be in German as well, so called Tibet Erklärt. No? So I hope they all read this book and be prepared, as you said. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and I did not thank the Tibetan community at the beginning for having organized it, so I apologize for that, and I thank you. And I will share this kathak with Mick Boltius, since she's the co-author of this book, and she should be credited as much as me with all the work that has been done.
Thank you so much. Your being here has been thank enough. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Vielen Dank an alle, die zugeschaut haben, alle, die dabei waren. Und ja, wir sind gerne noch, es gibt noch Kaffee und Tee draußen, tibetischen Tee, salzig und süß, von Kamala und Pemala gemacht. Gerne auch noch was zugreifen beim Snacken, genau. Und vielen Dank für eure Unterstützung.